Tēnā rā koutou katoa, korihi te mani takihiri mai I te ata. Ka awa tea, ti hei mauri ora. E te atua tēnā koe, e te manahiri motuhake ngā kai tono aue aroha mai. I te manuhiri tēnā koe, tēnā koutou ki a tātou kua tai mai nei, ki te tautoko, te kaupapa o tēnei rā. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa, e ino I tātou. E hōnoro, he karoria, he tātua. He waungarongo ki te whenua, he whakaaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te ātākura, hei tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. Kia ora and welcome everybody. Welcome to this prestige celebration today of International Day of People with Disabilities. My name is Chrissy Cowan and I am the Chief Executive of the oldest and only Indigenous disabled lead organisation in Aotearoa, ka po Māori Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I also have the privilege of chairing the Access Alliance. I welcome every one of our allies and supporters, in particular our international guest this morning, David Nipovsky from Canada, and I understand David Capozzi from the US will also be joining us this morning. I now would like to hand it over to Juliana, I understand that's right, to do our housekeeping. Ngā mihi, Juliana.
Ngā mihi, Chrissy, thank you so much. Tēnā koutou katoa. So my name is Juliana Carvalho, and in New Zealand Sign Language, this is my sign, because I'm in a wheelchair. I am a white female with blonde hair, and I'm wearing a black top for those who can. It's an absolute pleasure to be your MC today for this webinar. First things first, let's get into the housekeeping. Please keep your microphones on mute. You can put questions and comments in the chat as they come up. Our team will summarize and we will address this at the question Q&A session. So on 29th of October, Honorable Colonel Sepulveda, Minister for Disability Issues, announced that the government will introduce accessibility legislation into Parliament by July 2020. The announcement was definitely a milestone for all of us that have been campaigning with the Access Alliance for quite a few years now. But there's always a but. The government proposal is not good enough, as it won't deliver the 13 principles of the Access Matters of the Access Alliance. And it won't set a timeline, what is a big problem, because we know that people with disabilities have a shorter lifespan. And I guess I really want to be here to see this, fully accessible New Zealand. We won't have enforceable standards, so we're going to have to rely on people's goodwill. While we know that, with the disability strategy, kind of doesn't deliver what we need. And it won't have real force and real effect, which is the 13th principle of the Access Alliance. One day prior to the government announcement of the new Ministry for Disability, the national rollout of Enabling Good Lives, and the accessibility legislation, we had the launch of the legal independent research report, Making New Zealand Accessible, a design for effective accessibility legislation. Honestly, I love Warren Foster, Tom Baraclough, and Curtis Barnett. Love your work. These guys put together, they've done amazing research, and they set out to design a legislation that will be effective in identifying and removing barriers that cause disabling experiences. Because when we adopt the social model, we know that the problem is not in the disability. The problem is when we have an interaction with an environment that disables us. This report was funded by the New Zealand Law Foundation, and it is an amazing opportunity for our law and policymakers to develop a regulatory system that will definitely bring change. To the accessibility barriers, the proposed legislative framework includes an act, a regulator, a tribunal, accessibility standards, and a way to notify the regulators of the barriers. I really like this idea of removing barriers that create disabling experiences. You know, one of my first experiences when I moved to New Zealand in 2013, and I was working as PA to the Director of Advocacy at the Health and Disability Commissioner's Office, was it was a building on the Queen, right? And there was a brand new ANZ branch that was open when I just was working there. And I remember my boss back then saying, "You won't believe it. This ANZ branch is brand new and it's not accessible." And myself as a, just arrived from Brazil, really engaged disability activist in Brazil, I was like, what? I can't believe it. Let me check. So I went there and it was true. It wasn't accessible. And then I make a fuss. There was an article in the New Zealand Herald, talking about the disabling experience and stuns migrant from Brazil, And then the bank, ANZ, say in the report, they said, "Oh, we couldn't find a solution for that." A week later, there was another article saying kids, the problem, the biggest bank in the country could not solve. The kids come up with this kind of a lift that could go through the steps. So it's always about the willingness, when we don't have enforceable standards, and that's not good enough. I will now pass the word for David Nipovsky, this amazing Canadian lawyer, disability advocate, and let's start a reflection on where are we now and where we need to go to really create accessible New Zealand. David, the virtual stage is all yours.
Thank you very much. It is wonderful to be able to speak to you. I regret that I have to do it, however, from my home in Toronto, Canada, where winter is approaching, when I'd love to be in your amazing country with such wonderful people, to be able to speak to you directly and in person. I've looked at what the government is proposing to offer you. And put simply, it is very strong on good intentions, but it is utterly impoverished when it comes to implementation. I read this document, and the first thing that occurred to me is, this took 3 years? This could have been written in a couple of hours. In fact, if you were to listen to the speech, and I'm provided the organizers with a link to download the audio of it. If you look at the talk that the Access Alliance had me give 3 years ago on November 6, 2018 to the Office of Disability Issues, you'll find more in that talk than in this entire paper in terms of ideas of what's needed. And that's not because I've got such great ideas. It's because this document has so few. What's wrong with it? Well, the first thing is it starts out with a completely impoverished goal. The document does not say that the goal of the government strategy and its legislation will be to make New Zealand accessible for people with disabilities. It says the goal is merely to improve accessibility. those words are utterly and cruelly diluted. Improve accessibility. Fix the accessibility of one toilet stall in a hotel in Dunedin, or stick a ramp in or braille on the elevator buttons in one public building in Rotorua, and guess what? The goal of the entire program has been met. We've improved accessibility. Not much, but heck, all they've got to do is improve it. The document talks about making New Zealand more welcoming for people with disabilities who come to New Zealand as tourists. I've come there twice. It's a wonderful country. It's not a question of making it more welcoming. You're wonderfully welcoming people. It's about making it accessible for tourists with disabilities. When they use language like progressive realization or accelerated, it all sounds very good, but all it means is if you're starting from really slow and very little progress, you don't have to do much to just speed it up a little or make a little bit of progress. But what it does mean is that people with disabilities in New Zealand are never entitled to actually get there. So that's bad enough. Once you start out with the wrong goal, everything else fails. But there's more. I know that we believe in nothing about us without us, but frankly, give me a break. We're talking about having consulted for 3 years so that they can now consult before they pass legislation, which is all about, guess what? Consulting. I mean, if you boil it all down, what they're saying is we're going to have a new board, which will consult and give advice and feedback and staff to help them do it so that we can all try to coordinate and talk to each other about what we should have been doing already. Respectfully, I don't think that's going to change things much or at all. I have to tell you that when I look at this legislation in this package, what they're talking about doing, we've been there. In Ontario 20 years ago, we had a provincial conservative government. We're nonpartisan, we'll work and do work with all parties. And they promised us legislation, and they delivered a law called the Ontarians with Disabilities Act 2001. In fact, it passed, I think, 20 years ago this weekend. And I got to tell you something. It wasn't a whole lot different than what I read in this document. Lots of good intention, focused mainly on government, no mandatory removal of barriers, no mandatory standards, no mandatory new enforcement. And guess what? It was a total flop. It was eventually repealed and replaced by a considerably stronger law, and that stronger law passed unanimously. Even the government, even the political party that passed this weak law later acknowledged that it was too weak. Even the minister who wrote this weak law was later to come before our own legislature and say, not only was his law too weak, but now in opposition, he said the new government's law was too weak, even though it was stronger. He wanted to make it stronger still. You don't need to learn now the mistakes that we made 20 years ago. I think people with disabilities in New Zealand deserve better than that. Now that's, along with a weak objective, that would be bad enough, but it gets worse still. This paper tries to draw a distinction between two kinds of legislation, as if the government had looked at the two, weighed them, and made a choice. It said we could either do an enabling piece of legislation or prescriptive legislation. And it decided to go for enabling legislation. And too bad the Access Alliance actually wanted the prescriptive option. Well, for one thing, it's a false distinction. You can have enabling legislation that is prescriptive. What it really is an excuse for extremely diluted and ineffective action, which is trying to make just make image prevail over substance. And not only that, But it goes further, because in rejecting the option of prescriptive legislation, it says places like Canada, the US, they have prescriptive legislation, and they point out supposed problems with those laws. They don't really do much. They cause confusion. Well, for one thing, factually wrong. For another thing, maybe the government officials should have talked to us about this allegation before they decided to make policy based on it, because it would have taken about 5 minutes to show them the error of their ways. Yes, the Americans with Disabilities Act could have achieved more and sooner, and certainly Ontario's legislation could have achieved more and sooner, and we're critical because it hasn't. But both have accomplished things, and certainly they've accomplished more than you'd see under the legislation and program they're proposing. Their assessment of the next problem, what they're doing is it's based on an assessment of the regulatory impact of what they're proposing. What they're missing from their assessment of the regulatory impact is probably the biggest point of all, which is, number one, they're going to leave it to every government department, every business, every organization to have to reinvent the accessibility wheel whenever they wish, as much as they wish, if they wish. And they're going to have to duplicate the same effort, probably make a whole lot of mistakes. That's like the most costly way of going at all. They are actually choosing the more costly version. They're going to allow more, by virtue of the design they're using, they're going to allow more barriers to be created while they consult about consulting, about how to pass legislation that's going to have more consulting. And while all that consulting is going on, guess what? New barriers are going to be created. And it's going to cost more to remove them. It would cost less to prevent them. So the regulatory impact of their option is wasting a whole lot of money while not making a whole lot of progress. Next problem, almost done. They've got this idea that they're going to set up some board. They're going to appoint some people with disabilities to it, and that's all going to be on them to figure out what's wrong, to figure out what to do. They're going to do, and then to hold the government accountable. Well, look how accountable the government's being right now to you folks in even designing this. 3 years, and this is what they got to offer. Don't hold your breath that some advisory committee is going to be able to do better. Unless they are independent of government and have power to make issue directions that are binding and enforceable, respectfully, don't hold your breath. And that's despite the fact that they can appoint the most wonderful, well-intentioned, expert people to that committee. And it's wrong to think that one advisory committee is somehow representative of people with disabilities. It's just not realistic to put that burden and expectation on those folks. Bottom line, folks, is that this legislation, if it does not require the enactment of accessibility standards that are binding and enforceable, if it does not create new enforcement mechanisms that are creative, constructive, and effective, you might as well just enjoy the status quo, but you're going to see it in cluster with a whole lot of very encouraging jargon in a government report. They replaces action with nice words that delivers image, but not substance. So what do you do about it? What do you do about it? Number one, make it clear you're not accepting this. Number two, let them go and introduce whatever bill they want, but be ready to propose amendments. Number three, you have an election next year if memory serves. And so what I would be doing if I were you is I would be approaching all of the opposition parties as well as the government with your concerns. Ask the opposition parties now to commit to more, ask them to commit to amendments, talk to them about the kind of principles that they need to be prepared. They can't draft the amendments till they see the bill, but they can agree that there has to be standards. They can agree that they have to be enforceable. They can agree that there have to be timelines. They can agree that there has to be new enforcement elements. Ask them to commit to those principles and to be ready to propose amendments to accomplish that. The government's proposing to amend this bill next summer. I don't know what's going to take so long. Given how little is going to be in it, they should be able to write it now if it isn't written already. But don't ever be deterred. It's frustrating. It's annoying. But that won't stop you, because you just got to be tenacious. This is what they offered the first time. Look at what we got 20 years ago. We didn't accept it. We demanded more, and we are continuing to point out wherever things are inadequate that they've got to be done better. And so I look forward to taking your questions. I look forward to being able to give whatever input and suggestions I can, if you'd like, both now and over the next month. But just keep on going, folks. Don't let them slow you down. Back to you.
Thank you so much, David. Very enlightening overview of what has been proposed. You know, when a few days after the announcement of the proposed legislation, MP Jen Logie, during the question Parliament, she asked Minister Cepoloni if it was true that the Access Alliance worked with the MSD official for 2.5 years, only for the government to choose the legislative framework that, you know, the Access Alliance could not support. And Cepoloni said that there are many facets of what government has announced, the Access Alliance don't support, and there are some things that we proposed that the government could not support. And she said that they want the government wants a regulatory framework that, you know, we just cannot support because it doesn't deliver what we need. And then Cepoloni said that that will mean that potentially accessibility legislation will be at odds with existing legislation. And that would have meant that the government will have to look at legislation across multiple areas, potentially try to make changes. In her own words, she said it wasn't feasible, not practical, to do the legislation that we want. So the government landed in this enabling framework, something that, you know, government is comfortable with. The word feasible kind of stuck in my head. You know, it's something possible to do easily and conveniently. That's what feasible means. And I want to tell the government what is not practical or feasible.
You are connected to computer audio alert. Zoom meeting.
It's not feasible to navigate this world in a wheelchair when all the places are not fully accessible. It's not feasible to hear, and that happened for real with me, to hear that you can no longer attend a group that I used to attend because they moved premises, and now the meetings I hold on the second floor. It's not feasible to hear that, to know that I cannot take my niece to the ballet because the place where she's doing the dance is not accessible. It's not feasible to not be able to attend a singles meetup because the encounter will be done at the balcony in a place where I cannot go as well. And it's not feasible. My friend Erin had to spend many months showering in the workplace because her house could not cater for her needs. It's not feasible when I got a call from the Auckland Transport saying that I should take another kind of transport because the ferry were not accessible for wheelchairs. It's not feasible not be able to enjoy the summer like everyone else is because accessibility is not existing in our beaches. And it's not feasible to keep up with the lack of information. I'm really talking about the deaf community here, that they are deprived from information. So they don't know what's going on. That's not feasible. And it's not feasible, again, as a personal experience, to spend 7 years fighting an immigration system that discriminates on disability grounds. It's not feasible to be invisible, to not have employment opportunities. And it's not feasible to live a life where every single day you face a disabling experience. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because sometimes people have goodwill, as David was talking before, but they don't know how to do it right. So we have those situations where, yes, there is a ramp, there is a tentative of accessibility, but the ramp is too steep because people don't know the standard, they don't have the information. You know, I'm originally from Brazil. In Brazil, we have since 2000 our own accessibility legislation. And in 2015, the government launched the Inclusion for People with Disabilities Act. It covers all the aspects: transport, education, work, employment, everything. And it was
I actually agree with you because people with disabilities get a lot more, they get what they deserve, we get a lot more. Like this legislature going.
Can you put your comment in the chat and then we're going to address that during the Q&A? Is that possible? So in Brazil, we treat lack of accessibility as discrimination. And just a refresher from the UNCRPD, discrimination on basis of disability means any distinction, exclusion, or restriction on the basis of disability, which has the purpose or effect of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal basis with others, all of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, and any other fields. It includes all forms of discrimination, including denial of reasonable accommodation. Yeah, so kind of I put something that was in my chest for a long time about, you know, what is not feasible to live in this world that every day we face disabling experiences. We're gonna play a video from my amazing friend, the disability advocate, Anya Costello. She is in Norway at the moment, but she keeps making a difference in Aotearoa, even from distant. Yelena, can you play the Anya video right now?
Yes, I'm about to play the video.
Perfect, thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Anya. I'm a disabled storyteller and advocate for disability rights and justice. I'm appreciative of the chance to speak to you today, and I do so in my personal capacity. When I got involved in this campaign for accessibility law back in 2017, I honestly did so in part because I was a uni student in need of a summer job. Jobs, of course, are hard to find when you're disabled. The rampant unemployment our community faces is one of many issues on which more robust accessibility standards could and should move the dial. But the other reason I got involved in the campaign was about responsibility. Specifically, I wanted to see Aotearoa take meaningful steps to show us as disabled people who are constantly having to ask again and again for our basic access needs to be met, that this country truly considers access to be a collective endeavour. Law change needs to be part of this beautiful vision. The legal status quo is not. For too long, specifically since 1993 under the Human Rights Act, the burden of proving that, say, I, as a disabled person, have faced a particular instance of discrimination falls onto me. According to the law, it's not the job of my school or my employer or some bureaucratic or punitive government agency I had to deal with to prove that they did not discriminate. It is my job to find help to manage to legally prove it happened. That is backwards. That is unfair. And that pattern of forcing disabled people to do the heavy lifting for access is exactly what this Labour-led government intends to continue to entrench. In 2022, this government is planning to introduce an accessibility bill with no teeth. Sure, an independent board of disabled people will be in place in part to monitor it, but this government have conveniently neglected to commit to creating independent mechanisms for enforcing that law. They've also neglected to commit to ensuring that new accessibility standards will be developed and enforced. Standards are the detailed instructions for how to make access happen, say in transport or education or media. They are the place where the real mahi happens, as we've seen from many other jurisdictions like the US, Canada, and the EU. This government needs to make sure the proposed bill commits to a robust process for making, monitoring, and independently enforcing accessibility standards in any area where the disability community identifies lots of systemic barriers. If they don't make that commitment, we're likely to continue with a piecemeal approach with no deadlines. This approach risks accessibility improvements inching slowly along. Incremental change might technically be progress, but that doesn't make it acceptable or enough. This law also needs to include a system for us to send in reports of access barriers, in the knowledge that our reports won't just get received, but promptly acted on. This system should make sure that our daily lived experience of access barriers feeds into what accessibility standards look like, so that we see those barriers getting removed. The Minister for Disability Issues has said, this framework will reflect a partnership with disabled people, recognizing disabled people as leaders, as experts on accessibility from a lived experience perspective, and as advisors to hold the system to account. Yes, centering disabled leadership and the leadership of Māori disabled in particular is critical. But disabled people have been holding systems that let our community down to account for decades. Successive rounds of disability strategies and action plans resulting in incremental change at best have already taught us a lesson. They have shown us that existing accountability mechanisms like governmental progress reporting and tough questions from disabled people's organizations, disability rights commissioners, and even the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities are far better than nothing, but they're not enough. That leaves me asking, with no enforcement mechanism or standards, what real power will the proposed Accessibility Governance Board have? And how is this law going to enshrine real systems change to remove barriers for disabled people? As disabled people, we need to be clear that we won't settle for anything less than an accessibility law with the teeth to hold those with power over our access accountable to their responsibilities. Finally, I want to share something personal. Last year, on March 21st, I got sick with COVID-19. After a couple of weeks, the initial infection went away, but a long tail of recurring and new symptoms did not. I became one of millions of people around the world and in Aotearoa managing the chronic illness long COVID. I'm telling you this for two reasons. First, we're collectively not very good at talking about the forms of access that disabled people who have non-apparent impairments or conditions or neurodivergence or mental illness need. We might need flexible working or quiet rest spaces or easier ways to prove our conditions or affordable taxi options. And this government needs to pay attention to our access needs in designing the accessibility law too. Second, you just never know when today might be the day you become disabled or more disabled. You might not yet accept the term for yourself, But the disablement caused by our bodies, or cultural norms, or attitudes and laws is nothing to feel shame about. So let's come together, disabled and not yet disabled, to tell this government that the Accessibility Act framework that they're currently planning on is a massive letdown for disabled people, for our family and whānau, and especially for all those who have campaigned, including as part of the Access Alliance, for this law to be robust and enforceable. Tell this government that now is the time to rewrite their draft bill. Tell them to make sure it commits to an efficient way for barriers to get reported and actioned, and most importantly, accessibility standards with teeth. Tell them now, and tell them again next year when the draft bill goes to a select committee to get our feedback. Together, we can urge this government to take the decisive political leadership and responsibility Aotearoa needs in order to become truly accessible. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya, for continuing doing the mahi even from distance. We're going to now address some of the questions that came up. I think, Elena, are you going to read out loud the questions for David and I?
Yes, I am, and I'm just going to sort this out as well. And David, here we go. Right. So, hi everyone. My name is Yelena Zedov. I work behind the scenes in the Access Alliance Secretariat. So, I'll start by saying that we had a lot of support for David and Anya's kōrero, which just shows how lucky we are to have such great advocates on board. And we had a lot of comments about individual experiences, which really just spoke to the need to get this law right now. And I guess the key question that I would put to you is, just 1 second, is how do we unify the disability community to claim their right to accessibility? And what role can allies play, and how can they support the movement? So I might begin with Juliana and then hand over to David.
I might put David on the hot spot and then.
I'm happy to answer it.
Yeah, just you started because you're our special guest.
All right. Well, first, we don't need to unify anyone. My view is we just need to achieve harmony. Unanimity is not possible. The goal of accessibility speaks to all people with disabilities because we all face different barriers. Depending on our disability, they may be different, but they're all barriers and we need accessibility, which is a shared thing. So what do? Number one, the way we harness our allies and both individuals and organizations is you get them to tell their stories. Everybody on this Zoom meeting has their own stories of barriers they've encountered or barriers their loved ones have encountered or just barriers they've witnessed. And that is the proof why we need this legislation. And all you need to do is for every single one of you to go to your member of parliament or to contact one of the members of parliament or opposition parties and tell them your story and tell them you need the mandatory legislation the Access Alliance needs, and tell them that your barrier, your story won't get fixed by more consulting and more talk and a board of a few people with disabilities who won't have power to force anybody to do anything, or compel, I should use the word force, but to require anybody to do anything. And so, and I'd say to them, we've waited more than 3 years for this, and we shouldn't have to wait longer. and ask them to add their own voice to the need for strong and effective legislation. That's how you do it. And the other thing you do, you've got newspapers, write a letter to the editor. You've got radio stations, call into one of those radio stations. Talk to them about your story, and then link your story to the need for this law. Back to you.
Thank you so much, David. I think we've been doing that a lot, you know. Actually, if people that are watching us today want to do that and, you know, approach their local MPs, they can. We have resources in the Access Alliance website. You know, we have a template and things like that. But as Anya said, it's always it's always an effort, an individual effort, and that's exhausting, you know. You said that we should not unify. I do agree that we cannot have like, it's just everybody, you know, with the same opinion and da. But at the end of the day, if we look at the big picture, we all want the same thing. We want better outcomes for people with disabilities in this country. And in New Zealand, I found, as a disability activist from other country, I found that people operate in silos here and don't communicate and don't, you know, they don't come together for that big picture that will benefit everyone. So the reality is we have this bill being introduced in July 2020 that is not going to deliver what we want. What can we do? What can we do? Can you share, David, some of the tactics that you use in Canada to achieve what you guys have achieved?
Yeah, I'm going to start from the fact that I'm going to disagree with one thing you said, not to disagree with you, but to say you said in July they're going to introduce a legislation that does not meet our needs. That's their plan right now. But that's 6 months from now or 7 months from now. That means you got 7 months to get them to come across with something better. Don't treat this document as the final word. Treat it as the first word. I'd go back to the government and say, okay, that's your first offer. Now we can have a conversation. Because I've given you in just 8 or 10 minutes, and I'm happy to give you more, ample reasons. You already know them, but ample reasons to just take this message and say, people with disabilities deserve better. We deserve better than just one toilet stall fixed in Dunedin. Or one hotel with Braille on the door, on the room numbers in Rotorua. We deserve better. Don't you agree? And take that forward. And it is a campaign. If you're doing it now already, that's fantastic. But you just keep doing it and do more and think of more creative ways to do it. And the thing is, I would start having Zoom meetings with individual members of Parliament right now like this, because you can record them and talk with them about what you need and what's been offered, and ask them individually, do you agree? And if they're opposition, say, what would you be prepared to do? And the beauty of doing those meetings is you can record them and post them online. So you can hold that up for public, the public to see. You can post them online. And if they're government members, say, look, I know that you're not the minister, but can you agree that you'll go and try to get the minister to change their position? I mean, this could well not be the minister's own view. She could be directed this.
David, it's not the ministers in New Zealand, it's the CEOs of our government agencies that's the problem, because they remain in power long beyond the MPs. The MPs will say anything and everything to shut people down, and when push comes to shove, they do not do anything. Our media is selective about what information they provide. The only way we can do it is to go to offshore, use our own blogs and be the media ourselves
Yep.
and go
Thank
to
you
the
so much
United
for your
Nations.
comment, Adriana. And it's been great to see all the engagement in the comments and the corridor. Now, I will just hand over back to David and Juliana to wrap up a bit more about the tactics. And I would love to arrange an offline with you with the campaign team, because we love your energy.
Oh,
and I
yes,
want-
it's 30 years of trying to get toilet facilities in an MSD offices and, you know, different people, right? And Carmel Cipollone comes up with no, can't do, when I have come up with a good solution, easy solutions to solve that problem.
And that's what this is all about, Adriana. So I'm going to hand over to our to Juliana and David, because I'm very aware I've done a bad job of managing the time. So over to you.
Well, I'm just going to say, when I read this thing, it reads to me like it was written by public servants who don't want to, who are thinking from the perspective of don't make us do more. But frankly, that could be the directions they're getting. That could be the directions they're getting from the Prime Minister's office. It's not clear. But this is where it matters to get to politicians one at a time and get them through Parliament, which makes the laws, to make the changes that the public servants then have to follow because it's the law. And you will also find within the public service, and we found this here, that there are individuals within the public service that can be individually very supportive, but when they get all together, there's a kind of group mindset that prevails. Well, work with individuals to help work around that group mindset. But this is a process of just, you know, hammering away one member of the legislature at a time. And the only way you are assured to lose is if you don't do it. I can't tell you how many times I've had politicians or their staffs tell me, this is as much as you're going to get. We've really given you, we've gone to the well, this is all you're going to get, hoping I'll go away. And of course, I just smile like, okay, as far as I'm concerned, that's your first offer, but we're carrying on. Back to you.
Thanks, David. Thank you so much. We are a bit of behind our time. So I will pass to Chrissy now to make her remarks.
Kia ora, Julian. Yeah, well, I just want to just quickly add in, because I do appreciate we're short of time, but I think we need to first of all recognise some achievements of what the Access Alliance journey has been, and the fact of where we're at now and where we wish to proceed. So there's a very quick synopsis. The Alliance, of course, was formed in 2017 by 10 organisations from the disability sector, and there was providers and disabled-led organisations and accessibility advocates. We came together and agreed to run a campaign that would influence government to introduce accessibility legislation into Aotearoa, New Zealand. Two of our key objectives was to have the Titi o Waitangi be given meaningful effect, and that the Access Alliance principles be embedded throughout the legislation. Yeah? What occurred, of course, if we roll in now, and we had the support of this kaupapa spread quickly throughout Aotearoa, New Zealand, and by the end of 2020, we have and continue to have over 20,000 supporters. And this is from all areas of our community: individuals, organisations, business, service providers, disabled-led organisations, carers, parents, people who saw our vision. So of course, on the 29th of October 2021, Minister Cipollone announced significant changes that the disabled community had been waiting for, and they were long overdue. Of course, one being the introduction and rollout of Enabling Good Lives, the other, the establishment of a ministry for disability, disabled people, of course, they're still naming, to find the right name, and of course, the introduction of accessibility legislation into Parliament, into law, introduction in July next year, 2022. Sometimes we forget, and one thing we need to do is congratulate ourselves, our grassroots workers in particular, because we achieved our goal. Our goal was to lobby government to introduce accessibility legislation. Of course, what we did not achieve, and we made that very clear to the minister's officials and minister herself, is the fact that the Access Alliance 13 principles are not embedded throughout that legislation. We didn't want 2 or 3 of the principles. Collectively, all of our supporters and members of the Access Alliance steering group, we want 13 principles. So we're at this impasse with Minister and her government. As David and other speakers have eloquently said, it has no teeth, and there's an opportunity because there's been a paper and a framework put out there that would potentially meet all the requirements that our people are wanting to see. So we've always been very clear, we're politically neutral, and we want to continue to run a campaign about that because we do not want this kaupapa to become a political football. At the same time, we want to bring and include all of our 20,000 supporters throughout Aotearoa and internationally, I must say, and to along with us on the journey. We need to unite, and we have demonstrated we are able to unite and embrace other communities, not just the disability community. And that's because everyone at one stage in their life, like Anya's talked about, will have barriers that will prevent their ability to access services, information, technology, and buildings, then the list goes on. So we need to work together because the Access Alliance is at a point now, and as David has said, we need to now stand up and remain united, because the 13 principles that we talk about, and I'm sure, Anya, you've all read them, we feel, we're adamant, have to be in there if it's to reflect what the disability community has always said around accessibility legislation. Yeah? So, we need, but at the same time, we need to continue to be positive and respectful in our engagement. And I must acknowledge the fact that even though for the last 6 months we were on different, we did not agree with ministers' officials' view in the paper that's been presented, the proposed framework, we did that with respect. So we must continue. So when we're campaigning, we continue. We're very clear. We want our 13 principles reflected. We want a structure that doesn't put the onus all on the disability community. We want to empower and access advocacy. So how can we ignite that passion in every, not only our disabled community, but all of Aotearoa? How can we unite everyone to again influence the minister, her officials, to the fact that disabled people in Aotearoa deserve and want legislation that will fully reflect their views and our views of our community katoa. So that's just some thoughts on my part. Juliana, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. Okay, the theme for this year of the International Day of Persons with Disability is leadership and participation of persons with disabilities toward an inclusive, accessible, sustainable post-COVID-19 world. We need to get together and make this happen. There's a lot of, creative solutions and innovations out there that can help us. And I will pass now the word to Dan Shepard. So he will talk about the Snap, Send, and Solve. That is a way of collecting data, which can be used for the standards. Dan, thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thanks, Juliana, and good morning, everyone. I've been asked to join the group this morning to share a little bit about my own story and how that relates to an exciting new trial that Blind Low Vision NZ will be delivering to better understand our community's access needs. So my name is Dan, and I'm the regional manager for the South Island for Blind Low Vision New Zealand. I wear two hats. I'm also a member of Blind Low Vision New Zealand and have retinitis pigmentosa. I'm currently low vision, and back in 2018, I started using my white cane in my community to support my mobility. When I did so, when I started using my cane, I almost immediately understood that my cane meant more to me than just supporting my mobility. It supported my opportunity to be a leader in my community for accessibility and for awareness. Over the last 2 months, my story has changed somewhat, and I've been blessed to be matched with my first guide dog, Ezra. He has changed my story, but I've very quickly learnt that he has changed my access needs in my community also. So how does this relate back to a project that Blind Low Vision New Zealand are calling I See Barriers in partnership with Snap, Send, Solve. Now, currently there is not, as has been discussed previously this morning, is that there's not a reporting mechanism for access barriers in the community. So we sought to provide a solution to that problem and have partnered with mobile app developer Snap, Send, Solve, who are based in Richmond, Melbourne, who provide a reporting tool that you can report discrimination offences against accessibility within your community. What we will be doing at Blind Low Vision New Zealand is working with our guide dog teams in the Christchurch, central Christchurch area, but also South Auckland, on providing those people and empowering those people with a mechanism to report their access barriers that they encounter on a daily basis. So Snap, Send, Solve are helping us to gather information directly from our community around what access barriers we face daily. Myself, as part of a guide dog team, I'm excited to be part of this trial and to share what access barriers I encounter on a daily basis. Over the time that we collect this information, Blind Low Vision New Zealand will be better informed on what access barriers our community face. And I think we can all agree that if we're to drive change as a collective community, we need to better understand what access barriers are, and the people that we can best understand what barriers are in place for are our community. So we're looking forward to, through I See Barriers, to empower our community to be advocates for access. Thanks, Juliana.
Thank you so much, Dan. Not easy, it's a great solution, easy to do, and everyone can participate. Okay, we are right over time. I just want to make some remarks here saying that we need every single person with disability to take the lead, so we can create this New Zealand that is accessible and will leave no one behind. We are planning 2 things. In February, we're going to have another webinar, and we will have Judy Human She is the disability activist from US. That is the star of the Crip Camp documentary. And, you know, we're going to keep this conversation with international disability activists to ignite really the desire and the entitlement that people with disabilities in New Zealand deserve better. We deserve better. I will now pass to Chrissy again for the Karakia. And please, you can put on the chat any ideas that you have. You know, we need to keep the conversation going, and put on the chat your ideas for what can we do as a community to create the legislation and to create the New Zealand that we want.
It's David Nipovsky. Can I just mention one more thing?
Of course you can, David.
Actually, I lied. I'm going to mention two. The first thing is you folks have a huge potential to make progress. You've got fantastic people. You have come an enormous way, like Chrissy was saying, since the Access Alliance started a few years ago. You've got an agenda for reform. You've got great people. You know what you need, and you're going into an election year. And those are the, and now you've got tools like Zoom. So whether it's me or Judy Hubert or others, you can get ideas from abroad and you can pull ideas together. And you know, I'm certainly willing to help you. And I know there are lots of other people who would too. So that's point number one. So you, and you got the government talking legislation, not the right legislation, but all right, we got them in the ballpark. Now let's get them to get ready to play ball, like seriously. The other thing I'm going to say is if you want to know more about or follow our advocacy efforts here, I'm going to give you two tips. Either follow us on Twitter at AODA Alliance, at AODA Alliance, and or go to our website and sign up to get our email updates, because feel free to steal any ideas we have and send us any of your ideas. You just go to our website and there's a sign up link right on the homepage. The website is www.aodaalliance.org, aodaalliance.org. So I want you to leave this. It's frustrating to see what the government's offered you so far, but it's only the first round. Let's work together and let's move forward. Best to all of you. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, David. Yeah, let's keep pushing until we get what we want. Chrissy? Oh.
Thank you, Juliana. Am I on? Oh, yes. Okay. So today, let's not forget, we celebrate International Day of Disabled People. Before I close our hui today with a karakia, I'd like to just convey some thanks. Firstly, I'd like to thank our speakers from across the oceans, David and Anya, for reminding us why we need to keep going. It's always a pleasure, David, to hear you, I hear your thoughts and share your thoughts on the journey of obtaining accessibility legislation in Canada. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you in person sometime in the near future. Anya, I also want to acknowledge her sharing the fact that she actually got COVID, had COVID-19, you know, and I understand it really knocked her about. So, you know, kia kaha, Anya, and thank you for again demonstrating from across the seas, a Kiwi continuing to advocate for the rights of our community here in Aotearoa. Juliana, ngā mihi ki a koe e hine for facilitating today's hui. You've done a fantastic job and kept us moving and kept us on track. Blind Low Vision New Zealand, I'd like to acknowledge John and his team for hosting today's event. And ngā mihi tino nui ki a koutou katoa to you, our grassroots supporters and advocates who are out there knocking on the doors of MPs. Without you, we would not have got where we have today. But as everyone has said, we've still got a way to go, like David has shared. I also want to acknowledge, I understand David our guest from David Kaposi from the US was also online. And hopefully we can have a talk to you, David, in the near future as well, and have you share some of your insights. So as Juliana has said, we have sort of gone over time, but you know, in Māoridom, time does not mean anything when the kōrero is rich and has been rich today. I know there's been many people who've wanted to contribute their thoughts. Please do put your notes in the chat. Yelena will ensure that, you know, we get feedback and make sure your kōrero, your whakaaro, your thoughts, what's in your heart is expressed as we go forward. So with ka tiki taku kōrero, I wish to at this time also, it's quite scary to think of, but wish everyone Christmas greetings and celebrations as we come very close. It's only like 3 weeks ago, after not only in this country, but throughout the world, having to again continue to adjust our lives so that we stay safe and free from this thing called COVID. So ngā mihi ki a koutou katoa. Thank you everyone for attending today. E inoi tātou. Kia tau ki a tātou katoa, te ata whai o te o tātou ariki, a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhi, ngā tahitanga, ki te wairu a tapu, ake tonu, āmene. Ngā mihi ki a koutou. Go well today. Kia ora rā.
Thank you so much, and watch this space. So you're going to receive another email inviting for our next webinar. Have a great International Day of Persons with Disabilities.